Hey there. Welcome to the EmberConf 2020 Tailwind CSS Best Practices training. This training is usually held in person, but because of the conference being canceled, it's actually online. So we're actually fortunate in the sense that we can share it with everyone now. This training is going to be about kind of how to best use Tailwind and the primitives it gives you. You know, if you're coming from a framework like Bootstrap, you might be used to having a lot more high-level UI components kind of out of the box. Tailwind is lower level, which is good in that it gives you basically unlimited flexibility. You can build kind of whatever UI on the web you can think of, but it doesn't give you as much out of the box to get started right away. So, you know, over using Tailwind for the last 2-3 years and utility first CSS for about 4 years now, we've learned a lot of kind of tips and tricks when it comes to building entire applications, laying out UI components, working with SVGs, and the Tailwind community has also come out with a lot of learnings and best practices over the last few years. So this training is not an introduction to Tailwind. You will get the most out of it if you've already used Tailwind and understand the basics of it. But it's really more focused on some of the kind of tough lessons we've learned and the best ways to get the most out of the framework so that, yeah, you can be really effective with it. So let's take a look at the repo here. So in the training, we're going to be going through a set of exercises in this repo. This is an open source repo here, and I'll put a link to it in the video. And this is just an Ember app. So all you need to do is basically clone it, run yarn install, and then run yarn start or Ember serve here. And so once you do that, I have it over here in our my editor right here. It's running already. You should visit localhost 4200, just like this, and you'll get redirected to exercise 1. And if it looks like this, you should be ready to go. Now, the README here has kind of our basic outline, so you can use this to follow along and reference after we're done. And this is also just the README file in the repository, so if you want to open this right in the code, you can follow along here as well. So, like I said, you will get the most out of this if you've already used Tailwind, but just as a little quick refresher here, let's just see kind of what it is like to work with Tailwind. So this training app right here is going to have all of our exercises, and you can see right here, you can kind of come over here and choose any one that you want, or you can just use this to kind of go through the exercises as we work through the training. So here in exercise 1, this is just going to give us a little playground to kind of play with kind of basic Tailwind utilities here. And to follow along, you'll find in the app components directory this exercises folder. And right here we'll have the exercise, which is going to be shown on the left here in the training app. And on the right, we have kind of the solution. So as we work through this, we'll be changing the exercise, and then you can reference kind of the final solution right there in that file. So for this exercise, let's say, you know, we wanted to make this HTML right here look like this styled HTML over here. And so, you know, Tailwind's kind of whole philosophy is HTML first. And the idea is that you stay in the HTML as much as possible, hopefully completely. You can really think of Tailwind as the Tailwind classes as an API for your design system. Now, in earlier versions of Tailwind, you were meant to have more control over your design system, and you would be customizing it a lot more than you do today. Whereas today, Tailwind comes out with an extremely well thought out set of utilities out of the box, and you really just think about hooking into those with your HTML. So let's say we were looking at this design right here, maybe our designer gave us, and we see, okay, the utility first here is a bigger text, so we want to make that bigger. So we just come up to here to H1, and we say text, and then this kind of IntelliSense Tailwind plugin I have shows you all of these classes that you have from Tailwind. And this is kind of what I mean when I say Tailwind is really an API for your designs. And if you come down here, we'll see these are all of the font sizes that come with Tailwind. So maybe we would just say this is 2XL font, and there you see it gets bigger. And it looks bold as well, so we can say font. Let's just try bold here. And it looks like it's centered as well. And it looks like this whole article here is kind of constrained. There's some padding around this article. So maybe we would add a div around this entire thing here. and add some padding. And these little p dash number utilities are what give us some padding here. And the background there is a shade of blue. So on this outer div, let's go ahead and make the background blue. And here you can see all the blues that come with Tailwind right here. That looks like it's the right color. And then maybe the article has a background of white. And it looks like it has some padding here as well. And again, I'm just going through this kind of quick just so you can get a sense of what it's like to use Tailwind if you aren't super familiar with it. We have some rounded utilities here we can use to add a border radius. We can add a little bit of margin top here to push this article down. This is starting to look pretty good. And we can add some margin on these paragraph tags. Maybe 8 on this first one. Looks like the text might be a little bit bigger actually, so let's go to 4XL. And maybe this next paragraph tag here has some more margin. And this list, we will give it as well. And let's go ahead and add some margin to each one of these paragraph tags right here. So this is another thing you'll notice, and what we're going to be talking, one of the things we'll be talking about is, if you come from writing your own CSS on every app you do, or every blog post you style, you might add some global rules here. But again, Tailwind's whole workflow is really kind of like what I'm doing right here, which is staying in your HTML, keeping all of the styling kind of local in a sense. It's using these global styles that are already available to us. I think this one's called list, list disc here. So we can get these bullet points in the list. And then let's add a little bit of padding here on the left, maybe a little bit more. 4, 6, kind of like this. So I'm just playing here. Again, you don't have to follow me exactly, and you have the solution there, but basically you can see how this is kind of working. And maybe we can add an overflow. I don't know if this will work. Overflow Y, auto, something like that. And maybe a height full here. But anyways, you kind of get the gist here of how this is working. And so, we've been able to style this whole thing. Maybe add a little bit more padding here using just these classes. Looks like the color here might be a little bit off black, so it's not pure black. So we can just go ahead and set the color to maybe gray 700. And so the benefit is you get this workflow where you are just not writing any new CSS, you're staying in the HTML, but of course there's some trade-offs as well. And so for example, here adding margins to every single one of our paragraphs seems like it might be a hard thing to maintain consistently throughout an entire application. So these are some of the sorts of questions we'll be addressing in this training. But basically the point with this exercise is just to kind of reinforce this notion that Tailwind is HTML first. The workflow kind of embraces HTML. It embraces that this is like the core part of the rendering of our application. And so it just says, let's hook right into it and not kind of break our flow going to another file or having to kind of tweak certain specific values. We're just going to use this constrained set of styles that Tailwind provides to us. And again, it's pretty incredible if you haven't used Tailwind extensively, how far the default set of utilities can get you in styling a completely custom application. And so when it comes to building our own abstractions and using Tailwind effectively with other tools like Ember, like a front-end framework, we want to stay aligned with this philosophy, embrace this idea of staying in the HTML, and we'll see kind of what abstractions that leads us to create. So if we go ahead and switch over to exercise 2, let's talk about this first point, which is that we want to extract components, not classes. So again, when we're working in a framework like Ember, we have a great primitive available to us, which is an Ember component. And that's a great way to reuse HTML. So this exercise right here, we see kind of these two card treatments, and on the right is the final version and the left is kind of our exercise. And you'll notice that this picture on the right, it looks good when we resize it. And that's because the container has a fixed aspect ratio based on the contents of the image here. And so as we resize it, it doesn't change. So let's come over and take a look at that code here in exercise 2. And here we see kind of our image right here. And then the lorem ipsum text is in this div right here. And so the question is, we want to make this image right here kind of preserve its aspect ratio. So the way we can do this first kind of has nothing to do with Tailwind or with Ember. It's just a little CSS trick that is really handy to know. So the way we would do this is go ahead and wrap this image tag in a div. And it uses this trick in CSS that percentage padding is based on the width of the immediate parent, the container right here. So if we use some of these padding bottom utilities right here, we have the kind of spacing scale from Tailwind with these numbers, but then if we go down, we have a bunch of ratios as well. And so let's say we were to go ahead and add this padding bottom of 75%, padding bottom 3/4. If I save this and check out the code, we're going to see that this div has taken up this space right here. And let's go ahead and make it red just so we can kind of see this div. So this is adding a padding of kind of 3/4 of the widths of the container. And you'll see if I shrink this, that the aspect ratio here stays the same. Similarly, if we were to say padding bottom is full, so 100%, we should get a perfect square right here that stays the same even as I resize this window. So that's kind of the overall trick with this fixed aspect ratio component here. Now, in order to get the image to position itself within this div, which is now kind of a fixed aspect ratio, we can go ahead and make this image absolutely positioned, but we want it relative to that div right here. So we need to actually set a position of relative on this div so that it uses this as its positioning parent. And so now, if we were to pop open the inspector here and just make this, let's say, opacity 50%, you can see that this image is positioned within this parent div right here. And the last thing we can do is make it fill in the whole space. Another really cool workflow tip here with Tailwind is to use these dev tools and this class list right here, inspector. This is going to let us quickly add and remove classes just here in the dev tools and kind of see immediate feedback. And I use this all the time when I'm building apps with Tailwind. So what if we were to give, and I have this image selected right now, so it's right here, it's selected. And so we can see that the image already has this H28, which is a fixed height right here. It has object cover. And this class controls kind of how it resizes if the image dimensions don't match up with the native image dimensions. And then it already has a width of full right here. So let's just uncheck these so we can kind of get a good understanding of how this absolute positioning is working. So right now we have the image absolutely positioned in the parent. We want it to take up the full parent because that's what's controlling the ultimate display here. So if we were to make it full width and full height, like this, the image does take up the full parent, but now it's kind of distorted. So we could go ahead and add this object cover back, and we'll see that the image will retain its original dimensions, and we'll just crop off whichever dimension kind of overhangs here. Similarly, we could use the object contain if we wanted to make sure that the picture could be seen in its entirety, and then we could maybe use some black bars or something like that to show outside. But for our cases, we want to use the cover utility here so that we always fill up the parent. So now if we come back to the parent here, we can see we have this padding bottom of 100%. And we can see here if we were to try some different padding values, let's say 2/3. 2/3 looks pretty good for this picture. So now we basically have this behavior that we have in the solution here. So let's come back and add the padding bottom of 2/3 as well as the full width and height to our image. So padding bottom 2/3, we already have the width full, and we'll just remove this hard-coded height and make it height full here. And so now we have this fixed image right here. So that's pretty cool. It's a really nice technique to use if you want to maintain the aspect ratio, and also when you first load a page, as the image is loading, the height is already known, so the content won't reflow. So this is like a really useful CSS trick to have in your code base. And now if you're used to normally working with kind of CSS files or just custom CSS that you write yourself, you might think that a good way to extract this behavior and share it is with a custom CSS class. And in fact, other CSS frameworks have classes for fixed aspect ratios like this, because it would be a lot of details to remember, every time I need a parent with a padding bottom and a relative, and then I have this absolute. It's kind of hard to reuse if we have to repeat all of these classes. So again, you might be tempted to do something like, well, let's go ahead and make a aspect ratio container class, and then we'll have an aspect ratio child class here. And then maybe we can have something like a 16:9 aspect ratio or a 1:1 for a square, things like that. The problem with this approach is that, it really kind of breaks up our flow. We have to go start writing custom CSS, and we end up just introducing a new way to add styling to our application. Whereas so far, it's nice that we've been able to stay in HTML and just hook into Tailwind utilities. So because we are using a front-end framework like Ember, components are actually the perfect way to reuse some of this behavior, even if it's just styling. Even if you would normally think I'd only make, an Ember component to share JavaScript behavior, it's actually a great way to reuse both CSS and HTML as well, because as you'll notice from this problem that we're working on, it's not just the styles that we need to share. We actually have some structure to share as well. So this is why Ember components are such a great solution for this problem of how to share this fixed aspect ratio behavior. So let's go ahead and generate a new component. And I'm just going to call it aspect ratio. And so now we have this new aspect ratio component right down here. And so far it's just kind of an empty template that just yields out. So let's think how we might abstract this. Well, if I could just drop an aspect ratio component right here, maybe pass in a ratio as an argument, and then go ahead and pass in the ratio, maybe with something like 16:9. I think that's pretty clear that that's like a 16:9 aspect ratio, which you would see from a movie or most videos on the internet. And then whatever is kind of in the contents here, we would just be able to position this thing however we wanted to. So let's see what this might look like. I'm just going to grab this HTML right here and paste this in our aspect ratio component. And so this parent is going to be relative. It's going to have the padding. We'll leave this as 2/3 right now. And then inside, instead of having an image here, let's just make a div that is absolute and is full width and full height. Now with absolute positioning, we can actually use another little trick here. We can use the inset utility to go ahead and set the top, right, bottom, and left of this div. It's just another little way to kind of say, go ahead and fill in your parent. So if we save this aspect ratio component and we come up here and save this, and we come take a look, we'll see that now we have the relative, there's the absolute, and it's the same dimensions, and there's our image. Okay, so far so good. Now let's make it so that our aspect ratio component can actually use the ratio that was passed in. So for this, we'll need a JavaScript class. So we'll go ahead and generate a component class for our aspect ratio component. And basically what we want to do here is, instead of hard coding this padding bottom of 2/3, we're going to want to say the style here is just padding bottom, and then whatever percentage we end up calculating based on this ratio right here. So let's make this a new property called style on our component, just like that. And so here we'll have a new getter called style. This ratio argument we can get from this.args.ratio, and we can split that on the colon. And then we want to divide. So in the case of 16:9 right here, we want to take 9 over 16, and we get 56.25. So if we multiply that by 100, we get 56.25%. So let's just hard code that and see this working. If we were to return padding bottom of 56.25% here and save that, well, let's take a look at our DOM. Looks like our image is kind of cutting things off. But it does look like the container here is sized correctly. So if we were to hide this image, we can see that our container does look to be 16:9. So it's giving us the right container, and it's still up to us with this image child here to say, let's go ahead and make this height full, width full, and then we can say we want this to cover this. So let's slap these classes on our image here. And now we have this wider image. So to finish this off, after we split the ratio by colon, we'll have 16 and 9. We just need to divide them. We can use reduce here to take the first and second numbers, and basically we just want to return the second over the first. So in the case of 16 by 9, we want to calculate 9 divided by 16 to get that 56.25%. So that's going to be our actual padding, and then we want to return padding bottom, padding times 100 to get it into percentage terms. So back in our app here, we should be able to change this to, let's say, 1:1. And now we have a square. And we can use, the other object properties to say, let's put this on the left, or let's put it on the right. So this is kind of showing you how you can still use Tailwind to compose in our UIs. We have the responsibility of maintaining this fixed aspect ratio up here in our aspect ratio component. But then our child here, the image tag, is kind of able to do whatever it wants with that space. So maybe now that we're narrow, what if we were really narrow, like 25 to 9? And we want to just show the bottom, we can do that. And so now we have this, HTML approach here. And of course, we don't even have to put an image in here. What if we wanted to just do some text, hello world? And what if we wanted to center this? So we could do something like wrap this in a flex. That's height full with item center and justify center. And we can make this thing background gray of 100. And so again, we can make this a 16:9 again. And it's really up to us how to use this space. So this is kind of something that took me a little bit of time to get used to when working with Tailwind, but has proved to be such a vastly superior way to build UIs, because you never get, it makes it much harder to get stuck into a bad abstraction. You can imagine here trying to come up with something, way more high level, like a fixed ratio image, and it takes in a source, and it kind of basically gives you a new API for all of these things. But as I've used Tailwind more and more, I've gotten more comfortable with keeping my abstractions lower level like this, because you're going to get way more reuse out of this aspect ratio component now that it basically doesn't care what is being rendered inside of it. It really is just about providing this fixed wrapper here and calculating the aspect ratio. So when you see folks in the Tailwind community say things like you should extract components, not styles, this is exactly what we're talking about. So let's move on to exercise 3. So here we have some nested routes. We can see we're at the URL exercise 3-child1, child 2, and child 3. And over here you can see in the final result that we have some active styles. So if we come over to exercise 3, it says, let's add the text indigo 600 and border indigo 500 as the active class arg. So you might see this in Ember, or I even see this in Gatsby. Basically, a lot of frameworks have this sort of API where you have a link that lets you link to internal client rendered URLs here. They take in the name of the route, and then this is a normal class attribute, but we can also pass in something like an active class argument. And so if I were to grab these classes here and paste them in, and go ahead and do this to both of these other links as well, every time this class is active, Ember is going to go ahead and apply these classes. So this is a nice API. It's very Tailwind friendly, because Tailwind is all about using classes in our HTML. But you'll notice we have a problem here actually, and that is that our hover styles are colliding with our active styles, whereas in the final version over here, they don't. And so you'll run into this from time to time where we have this class argument, and so we have over here hover text gray. Let's go ahead and wrap these. And this is always being applied since it's our static class attribute. And then when the class is active, we get text indigo 600, and the hover class is basically taking precedence over that indigo class. But we don't want that when the link is active. So what we really would want here ideally is to say something like inactive class. And when the class is inactive, then we want to go ahead and add these hover styles like this. And also we want to make it gray. And that way, we're just composing these utilities and we're not trying to fight over, which version wins. We have text gray 500 and text gray indigo 600 on these links down here. And it just so happens that it looks right, but when we hover, it doesn't. So, ideally we want to come up with very Tailwind friendly APIs like this. So what might we do here? Well, this is another great use case for creating another component that is just a very light, low level wrapper around link to that gives us this API. So let's go ahead and make this. So we're just going to generate another component and we're just going to call it link. And we're going to need a JavaScript file as well. So I'll just go ahead and create a link.js right here and start out with an empty component. So for link, and I'll bring these down here, we basically want to wrap the native link to right here. So we'll paste this in, we'll yield this, and we'll make this one up here a link. So we pass along route, so we can pass along route right here like this. This is the route argument that's being passed in from our calling template. Now for class, since class is an attribute, we can just say ... attributes. And if we go ahead and remove these two for now and just take a look at this, we'll see that some of these styles are still being applied here because we have passed that attributes through, except for these two right here, since we're not doing anything with those yet. So in Octane, this is how you kind of forward any HTML attributes from the calling site to the underlying HTML tag. So that's how we can forward class. And so now let's take care of active class. So active class is also going to be an argument. So we'll just pass that on through. Active class equals active class. And now this should turn indigo when it's active, and it does. And so now we need to take care of the inactive class API that we want to add to our link component. And for this, we'll come over to our JavaScript here, and we're going to need to use the routing service. So we want to go ahead and inject the router here. So let's import inject here from Ember service. We'll call that service here. And now we basically need a new property to tell us whether this link is active or not. So we'll go ahead and define an isActive getter here. Let's just drop a debugger. And then over here in our template, we'll just say if this.isActive, go ahead and output a little active label right here. So if we come back to our app, pop open the console here and reload, we should have access to this.router. And the router has a current URL property, which tells us what the current URL is. And it also has a URL_for method here that takes in the name of a route. So if we were to call this.args.route, we can calculate what the route is for this link. So basically, if this.router.current URL starts with this.router.url for this.args.route, then we know that this link is active. So now if we check out our app, we'll see we get a little active label here when our first link is active. So we know that property is working. And so to finish this off, what we really want to do here is toggle between the class list based on whether our link is active or not. So instead of using active class, we can just use class right here and say, if this dot is active, we want to pass in our active class from the argument, else we want to pass in our inactive class argument. And class is actually a concatenated property, so this class will append itself to any classes that are applied through the splattributes here. And we can go ahead and get rid of this label right here. So now if we save this, we see our active class is being applied, but when we hover, we don't see anything. And then when we go off, we see the hover class as well. So there we have basically fixed our bug, whereas over here, we're still using the old API and we can see the bug. So now we should be able to just come up here, replace all these link tos with links. And I'll just grab this class right here and use this one as well, because we know we want that for the static class list. And then I'll grab the inactive class as well and paste it in just like that. And it looks like these last two had some margin left on them as well. So margin left 8 right here. So there we go. We fixed the issue. And now we're not having to worry about classes clashing with each other. And again, I've basically run into this problem with almost every front-end framework that I've used. And so kind of embracing these lower level components, coming up with this API here, again, we could have opted for a much higher level component that did a lot of this work for us. But just by building this very simple link component that just kind of does this one aspect of what we need it to, we see that we've kept a lot of flexibility when it comes to building our UI. Even right here, we can go ahead and apply a margin left of 8 to these latter two links and just not this first one. And we weren't hit with any kind of unnecessary abstractions that didn't work out for our use case here. But now we have this really Tailwind-friendly API in active class and active class. And again, this just kind of goes back to this idea of embracing the workflow so that folks who use your components and APIs can stay in HTML land and not run into conflicts. Now, of course, if you didn't want to repeat this class list right here for each one of these navs, and let's say that this was a page header nav in your Ember app that you were using on many pages, what I would do here is wrap this up into kind of another higher level component, which would be something like a page link or something like this, right? And this would basically render a link, but it would just take in a label and a route maybe, but it would go ahead and use the link that we just created, passing in these list of classes right here to reproduce this UI. So this is kind of how you can stack these different components to reduce some of the duplication and ensure that developers are using your style components consistently throughout your application. Okay, so let's get away from some of these components and talk a little bit about layout with Tailwind. So in exercise 4, we have kind of this button group right here. And right now it's kind of left aligned. And over here, the final solution shows it being centered. So let's come check out the code for this exercise. So the button group here is laid out using kind of this old school float technique, where the parent is inline block and each one of these buttons is a float left. Now you're probably not using floats as much in your layout code anymore, but again, for me, when I started using, first tachyons and then Tailwind, learning about different layout techniques, this was basically how I learned about these techniques, was through using these utility libraries. And originally, building something like this, floats would be just fine. But you start to learn there's some pretty funky things about CSS. So if we wanted to achieve kind of this final result over here where this button group is centered, how would we do it? Well, right here, this parent is an inline block. So we see it has this width of 221. It's just based on the width of its children, right? But because it is inline, we can come here to the parent, come over here and look at the Styles tab, and use text center, right? So text center on the parent will center any inline elements that are children. But as you do more and more app UI development, there's a lot of inconsistencies between how you think and lay out inline elements and block elements. And if you just take a step back here, the fact that we're adding a class called text center, which is just setting the text align property, CSS property on this div to lay out a button group is a little strange. I mean, we're not centering text. We're just trying to center this UI element. And so in particular, Flexbox ends up being something that you become very familiar with when you use Tailwind because it's just extremely powerful and the utilities let you work with it very, very easily. So the way I would lay something like this out today would be, let's go ahead and get rid of these floats as well as this inline block parent and come back and take a look at this. Now we're going to see over here that there's some space between the buttons. Right now this is basically just a div with some rounding and a shadow, and then we have 3 buttons here. The spacing is coming from just the significant white space in our template, and then we have this shadow on the parent. So clearly we have kind of a layout issue going on right now. So Flexbox is going to help us out. We can go ahead and grab this parent, turn it into a flex parent with flex, and right away we're going to see that all these children kind of snap into place. And Flexbox is really about laying out children of different widths, kind of having this behavior of them snapping into place and then describing what happens kind of when they wrap. But you can see already just for basic situations here, this is just so powerful, right? We just added a flex on the parent. The buttons, we didn't have to float them or change anything about them. And right there we have some control. Now by default, we are using the flex row direction. That's just a default property in CSS. Tailwind also gives us this flex column CSS property, which changes the direction to column. So you can imagine a situation, maybe you're doing a vertical nav where that would be useful. But in this case, flex row works out great for us. And then the last bit here is that because we have in this UI component, the shadow being applied to the parent here, so it goes around all 3 buttons, we can see it's overhanging right now because this div is taking up the full width. So by default, flex is going to be display flex, but we also actually have an inline flex right here, which again is going to make this an inline element, similar to how inline block makes it an inline block element. And so with just the inline flex class, we're back to having this look just about right. So we can go ahead and add that to our HTML, and it looks good. And we could come back and do the same thing here where we grab this parent, and if we were to add text center, it will center it because this is an inline element. But again, we kind of want to move away from this, and we kind of want to use these great CSS primitives we have that are specifically for layout, like Flexbox. So how would we think about doing this to center this with Flexbox? Well, again, like I said, as I've used Tailwind more and more, I've gotten way more comfortable with small bits of my template kind of taking one piece of responsibility on at a time. So in this case, you know, I look at this div right here and these 3 buttons. This is really kind of one UI component. This is really, you know, our button group component right here. And I think it's nice that we can just render this button group and it just kind of does its thing and naturally by default lays out to the top and left of the parent. It doesn't do anything special, and that gives us more control. And so when it comes to laying things out, a lot of times I'll just make a new div just for the purpose of laying things out, or what eventually might become another component to lay things out. And we saw we could add text center here, but we can also use flex here on this parent to lay this out. So let's come back to our inspector. Let's go ahead and grab this parent right here. And I'm going to make it a flex parent as well. And so from the perspective of this parent, it kind of has this one child whose width is, you know, 221 right there. And so if I am a flex parent, well, now I can lay out my children with the items utilities as well as the justify utilities. And the justify utilities are going to apply along the main axis here. And so because by default we are flex row, justify will determine whether the children are at the beginning, middle, or end of the row. And so right here you can see, you know, these are all affecting the layout of this button group. I can say justify center to put it right in the center of the page. I can say end to put it right at the end, or start to put it at the beginning. So in this case, we want a center here. And I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so we have some more room. And just like that, the button group is kind of laid out by center. So again, just adding a flex and a justify center right here is enough to lay out anything that is a child in the center of this parent, which just happens that this is a button group right here. But as you practice with this more and more, you'll just get comfortable reusing this pattern throughout your application. And so again, this is just kind of to point out you will get very good with Flexbox as you use Tailwind more and more. And it's pretty neat to see this work with two button groups. We could just go ahead and duplicate this. And now our Flex parent here has two children. We can see when we're centered over here, it's just kind of putting these next to each other right in the center. But if we were to take that off, we can look at some of these other justify options. We can put space around. We can put space between, push them to the edges. I use this one a lot when I'm building navigation, where you kind of have part of the nav on the top left and then the top right part you want pushed to the right. We can put them both at the end, or we can put them at the beginning. So Flexbox is just really, really cool. Definitely something you want to get familiar with. Let's go ahead and delete this. Actually, let's leave that second group and just say, let's go ahead and justify between. Kind of like the way that looked. So that's the basics of Flexbox. You know, we haven't even pulled up the docs yet in this course because I do have this really handy plugin and I've used Tailwind enough to know it. And this is honestly kind of how I work. I usually just stay right here in my code just because of this excellent plugin. But I do find myself from time to time using Tailwind's docs, of course. The docs are great here. And so especially if you're learning about something new like Flexbox, you can find it over here in the side. Here's all the different properties. Or you can just press / and search for Flex and see all the rules right here. So let's go ahead and jump over to exercise 5, where you're going to kind of have a little layout challenge. So if we open up exercise 5 and go to the exercise, this is what we see. And if we look at the behavior of the solution, we definitely see kind of a different layout right here. Over here in our exercise, we just have, you know, an image, and then we have this div with this text right here, kind of all on top of each other. Whereas over here on the right, the image is on the left and the copy is over here on the right. Also, you'll notice if I grab this and resize this, the text flows over there. And if we get too small on the left-hand side, the image starts to shrink. But in the right-hand side, the image kind of stays the same. So for that, you're going to want to look at the Flex Grow and Flex Shrink utilities here to see how to reproduce that behavior over in the exercise. So for this part, go ahead and pause the video. Try to get the left-hand side of exercise 5 looking and behaving like the right-hand side using these Flexbox utilities. See how far you get, and I'll see you after you give it a shot. All right, welcome back. Let's compare our work. So when I think about laying out something like this, I like to break it up into, different pieces. And so right here, because this is really just, it's more or less like a 2-column layout, and we see the right column, which is holding the text, is kind of resizing and reflowing the text, whereas the left for the image there is kind of staying fixed. So this is really like, there's kind of a parent Flexbox right here. This is kind of one child, the image, and then this is kind of the other child right here. So that's kind of how I would first approach this. So let's come back to the code. And here we can already see in the markup we have the image, and then we have kind of this div right here wrapping these bits of content. So I think we should be able to just make this guy a flex. And because flex is a row by default, we're going to get the image right here and then the copy right here. So that's a good start. Now we see that there's some weird stuff going on here. When we change this, the image is growing, and that's because by default, Flex children are going to expand to fill their container. And so as the text wraps, it actually makes the parent taller, and the image is going to fill that height as well. But we don't actually want that to happen. So another trick is a lot of times, especially when dealing with images, because of just unique ways that the browsers will choose to kind of position them, sometimes it really helps to go ahead and add a div so that the flex child is a div. It's more of like a layout element and not the actual content you're laying out. And sometimes that can make things work a lot more predictably. So if we were to just add that, let's see kind of what the behavior is. Okay, well now the image has shrunk down a bunch, but it does look like it's not kind of getting distorted like it was before. So it seems like we might be a little bit closer here. But if we look over in the solution, we see that, the image is kind of taking up its own space, and really the text is the only thing that's being resized. So over here in the docs, you might have found the flex shrink documentation, which controls how flex items shrink. And so we have flex shrink, which allows an item to shrink if needed. And then we have flex shrink 0, which prevents an item from shrinking. And again, looking at this layout, that kind of sounds like what we're looking for. So if we were to go ahead and add a flex shrink 0 to this, this flex child right here and save it, well, now we can see that, it's not going to shrink even when we run out of space. So that's kind of the behavior that we were looking for. Now we see a little bit of gap right here between these two children. And the easiest way to deal with that in Flexbox is to just go ahead and add some margin here. So if we add some margin left using an 8 value here, maybe it looks a little bit less, maybe 6. Then I think we've kind of recreated this layout. Okay, one more with Flexbox, just because I love it so much. There's so many neat things you can do with it, and I want to make sure you're aware of all the ways, all the problems it can solve with layout and with CSS. So here we kind of have a blog post, and if we zoom out a little bit, we'll basically see that the solution over here has this fixed width aspect to it. The text has a certain measure to it, whereas over here on the left, the text is not constrained at all. And so in typography, there's this idea that there's an ideal number of characters per line to help readability. And so it's a really good idea in your UIs to constrain your text in a certain way. So let's come and open exercise 6 here in our project. And we'll see that we have a little bit of markup with some Tailwind classes, and that's what's styling our content over here. Now with constraining the width, you might be tempted to go ahead and add kind of a max width on the parent. So let's pop open the inspector here, and we'll see we already have this article element wrapping the entire thing, and Tailwind gives us these max width classes. So we can say, let's do a max width of, let's say, medium. And so now the article is constrained here, so we can see the text is much more readable. And then we can say, let's go ahead and say MX auto, so that the margins are auto. And now this is kind of measured and centered. But sometimes you'll have treatments like this where the image should be kind of full bleed. And if the parent is constrained, well, that makes it pretty hard. Okay, so what if instead we were to apply the max width to each one of these paragraphs? So this first paragraph right here, let's just add a max width of medium to it. And so that kind of makes sense that this class right here would be on this paragraph text because it really knows best about how to make this paragraph text readable. In the same way that paragraph chooses its own size and font weight and color, having this measure be embedded within the paragraph is something that is a really elegant solution to this problem in a lot of ways. So let's say that this was good and we like this. Let's go ahead and grab these other paragraphs and throw a max width of medium on them. So then the question becomes, well, how can we center them? And if we open up the inspector and look, well, the paragraph does have the max width, so we could come here and add an MX of auto to center it. But that kind of feels like we're starting to mix layout concerns with the actual paragraph of text right here. And again, as we've seen, a lot of times it's much, much better to try to separate these two things, even if it means adding a wrapper or something like that. Well, fortunately, with Flexbox, we don't have to worry about that. We can actually just come up here to the article, make the article a flex parent, and we see by default the row is not going to be what we want right here, so we'll go ahead and make it a flex call. And so now we're kind of back to just having the parent lay the children out in a single column. So remember, we have the align items and the justify content classes to help us lay out Flexbox children here. And the justify classes work along the main axis. So because this is flex column, the justify classes are going to affect how the content is laid out vertically. We don't care about that. It's laid out fine vertically. What we care about is kind of left and right, the horizontal axis here. So we want to use the align items utilities. So if we go ahead and take a look at these and we scroll through, well, now we see that these are going to affect exactly how those children are laid out. And because the children are a fixed width, the parent is able to center them just by using item center. So this is really cool. And I was really excited when I first kind of found this trick out, flex call item center. Because what does it mean? Well, it means that you can use these paragraphs of text with this class list here and not have to worry about whether they're going to be laid out to the left or to the right. And you see this a lot when you're building marketing pages. So if you wanted to reuse this kind of text treatment throughout your site, we can go ahead and generate a component. It's going to be a text component. I'm just going to grab this right here, come down to our new text component, paste this in, and I'll just replace this with text. And it's just like before. So this means we can replace all these with text. We have a super easy way to reuse these styles right here. Say if we're writing kind of some longer form content like this, but our parent still has total control over how it's laying these out. So I thought this was really neat and just goes to show how powerful Flexbox is in letting you, put these responsibilities together, like the measure of a text, which is going to change based on the font size. So you could imagine having this max width be dynamic based on the text size of the text component here, but still giving the parent control over layout. So just another really powerful technique. Okay, if Flexbox wasn't cool enough, we now have CSS Grid and CSS Grid utilities in recent versions of Tailwind. So let's take a quick look at that. So over here on the right, we have these three cards kind of laid out like this. And on the left, we see them just stacked like this. And if we make this smaller, we can see on responsive screens, the right-hand side does stack with the spacing in between before laying them out kind of in this 3-column grid. So you can totally build this with Flexbox, and it is good to understand how you might do that. So let's pop open exercise 7 here. And here we kind of see our 3 cards, just like that. So we can make this a flex, and that should lay them out like this. And then we basically want this 3-column grid. So the way you would do this in Flexbox, let's go ahead and wrap each card with a new div that has a width of 1/3. And I can't type 1/3 in Emmet here because it doesn't like that. So I just always do this and then do it like that. So now we have a flex parent, and we kind of have these 3 children with 1/3, with 1/3, with 1/3, just like that. So now we see kind of all the cards are filling up the total space of the parent in this kind of 3-column grid treatment. But over here we have kind of these gutters. And the trick for doing this with Flexbox and Tailwind, and you can actually find this in the docs, but I'll just show you real quick, is for each one of these column elements right here, let's just add some padding in the X direction. So let's say padding X of 3. So there we see it adds some padding, but note that it also removed the side from right here. So these do have gutters now, but they're no longer actually filling up the parent. And that's because they each have padding on both the left and the right. The way to fix this is to account for this padding of 3 by adding negative margin in the X direction of 3 on the parent. So you can see here when I toggle this, it kind of gives us back that room, and you can see the left-hand side now lines up with the text over here. So if we were to add negative MX3 right here, we now have this kind of treatment. So that works, but it's a little bit of a pain in the butt. And if we were to go ahead and make this small again, now we have to change our markup So let's say on small screens, we have flex column, and then on larger screens, we use flex row. And so this should make it a column on smaller screens, and then back to our normal layout here. But you can see kind of our whole layout is messed up here because we are adding these gutters in the X direction. Now that we're on small screens, we'll have to add them in the Y direction. So we'd have to come back and update all this. So this is kind of how working with Flexbox to do grid treatments is a little bit of a pain. So let's go ahead and undo all this. We'll even undo the wrappers and bring us back to just this kind of raw markup. And instead, we're going to use grid to make a 3-column grid. So I'm going to type in grid, and grid calls 3. And right here you can see kind of all these utilities that come with Tailwind. And just like that, we have a 3-column grid. We didn't have to do anything to the children. But the mic drop here really is this gap property. So gap 3, just like that, we have a gap. Looks like the gap is a little bit more. So let's make it 6 or 5. So gap is automatically going to apply spacing in between the elements here. And this is really cool. We got 3 columns on large screens. Let's go ahead and start with 1 column, calls 1, and then on large, bump it up to 3. Look at that. We have a 1-column grid on mobile screens. The gap property is still applying just in between. And once we get to big screens, we have the 3-column layout. So needless to say, if you're using grids in your layouts and you need gutters and you need to change these things responsively, CSS Grid is an absolute game changer. So go ahead and switch over to exercise 8. You're going to see this kind of details, this data layout here. And on the right-hand side, we have this kind of 2-up treatment. But once we get down to smaller screens, we see all these things stack. But basically, once we get up to the large screens here, we see that the label is in the left and then the data is over here in the right. So if you come back to your code and open up exercise 8, you'll see some instructions. Go ahead and add a grid on large screens. Hint, it's a 3-column grid. And you can also look up the grid column start and end section in the Tailwind docs. And this is going to give you access to some classes you'll need in order to reproduce this layout. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can recreate the solution over here in your own code base. All right, let's see how you did. So if we come over to the template here, we see that we're kind of iterating over the items. And so I think on large screens, we just want to turn this into a grid that has 3 columns. So we'll add grid and grid calls 3. Okay, so it looks like we do have 3 columns. But this text doesn't look quite right. One really cool thing about grid is if you use the inspector, you'll kind of see the actual grid and how it's laid out. So this is really, really neat. And basically here we want these last 2 spots in the grid to be reserved for this content right here. And so by default, grid is going to give each child kind of 1 section, 1 column or row based on how it's laid out. But over here for kind of the second column, we want this to take a span of 2. And that's the class that you would have needed to find. You know, if you look here in the docs at grid column start end, you'll see that's kind of how you span different columns or rows. So if we were to save this, come back and look at our work, now we see that this spans both of these columns right here. So that's pretty neat. And again, we can see right here, this kind of gets right up on this. And so maybe we want to add some gap between these 2. Simple enough. Large gap 3. Or 6. So again, hopefully you can see kind of just how powerful gap is. It really is a super powerful tool for laying out your UI components. And I think the Tailwind utilities do a really great job of keeping it super simple and approachable. All right. All right, let's talk about a few more tips and tricks with Tailwind. So in exercise 9, we're going to be looking at working with SVGs. And this is something else that really Tailwind taught me, the whole workflow, is how to think about laying this out. And a lot of times, you might see these kind of before pseudo elements if you want to get, something like this treatment right here with an icon in the input tag, or an SVG as a background, or just SVGs kind of used throughout your UI. Even right here, you can see in the app, I have some right here. And again, the Tailwind perspective of staying in the HTML even applies to SVGs. So you'll kind of be surprised how easy it is to work with SVGs if you just treat them like every other HTML element. So let's say we wanted to add this little email icon to our input, just like this. Well, the first step is to basically get the raw SVG. And you're probably using an icon library or icon set in your project somewhere, but when it comes to doing kind of custom layouts like this, it's really best to be working with this kind of underlying raw SVG element. A good resource to get some is heroicons.dev, which actually comes from the creators of Tailwind. These are all free, and this is a cool little explorer you can use to just find an icon, click on it, and it copies it for you. You can bring it right in your project. So let's say we already had this icon picked out, and it's right here. So this is an SVG icon. It's going to look like this. We want it to the left of our input right here. So let's just come down within this div and paste it in. So it looks a little bit big, but if we go ahead and select this, we see that it is in fact right next to our input. But you can see from the solution, it really just needs to kind of hug the left side of this border here, and that border is coming from the shadow on this parent div. So just like we used absolute positioning earlier, we can actually use that directly on the SVG element right here. So if we were to make this absolute, we can see it takes it out of the flow right there. But the top left of the SVG is actually bound to the top left of that div. Whoops, I lost my class. So the positioning is actually correct. It's just the sizing that's wrong. So how can we size this SVG? Well, the easiest way is to just use Tailwind's width and height utilities. So let's say we want it to be width of 5. We can kind of zoom in here and see that looks pretty good. And most icons are going to have the same width and height. That's just kind of how they're designed. And you can see that width 5 turns out to be 20 pixels on the screen. And so that's going to be a 20 by 20 SVG icon. So the orientation is right. The size is right, but we actually want it vertically aligned here. And again, Flexbox is going to come to our rescue here. We don't want to deal with vertical alignment and trying to figure out whether this should be inline or block. We're just going to go ahead and wrap this in a div that is specifically for positioning this SVG icon to make our lives a lot easier. So let's go ahead and throw these classes on here. We know we want this to width to be 5 and height to be 5, and we'll just leave that alone for now. And let's just work on this kind of wrapping div that we're going to use to help us position. So this is going to be the thing that gets an absolute position right here. And if we could find this in our markup, we really want this to be kind of the height of the parent. And that way when it gets its child, who's going to be width of 5, it'll take up that much width. The height will be full. And again, because we're using absolute, it's a little bit more expressive, I think, to use these inset Y utilities, which are going to set the top and bottom to 0. So let's go ahead and make this inset Y 0, which is going to make it hug the top and bottom of its parent, and absolute. And then let's go ahead and stick this SVG right back in there. So now we've got the SVG. It's still 20 by 20. We can zoom in a little bit. We've got this parent who's laid out like this. And let's use Flexbox to center this. So we'll make this flex. And if we drop item center, it should vertically center it just like that. So flex item center right on the parent. Let's add a little bit of padding to push this over. And then on the input, we can add some padding as well. And that way when we type, we don't kind of cover this icon here. So this will get padding left of 3, and then we'll come down on the input and drop a padding left of 10. And this is starting to look much closer. Now the next thing you'll know here is our color of our icon. And this is blue right now, and it's coming from this fill property on this path element. So a lot of times when you get SVGs, different parts of the SVGs will have either fills or stroke color applied to them. And again, to kind of think in terms of Tailwind and composition and reuse, the best way to deal with this is, in this case, we can go ahead and get rid of this fill, just like that. We see the browser is going to default it to black right here. But then we can use a little trick on our parent SVG and say the fill should be the current color. This is a really cool SVG property, which is going to let us use Tailwind's color utilities to style this icon. So what do I mean? Well, if I were to come to the SVG, come up here to the parent, and say text red 500, check that out. Now the icon is changing based on the color of the parent. So we can come back to our code right here. We only have to look at the SVG. We can see that our input has a placeholder of gray 400. So let's go ahead and make this text gray 400. Now we could either do it here or we could even do it on our SVG itself. But that way you've kind of encapsulated the details within the SVG, but you can still treat this, just like you were styling any other HTML element. And so now the icon matches the placeholder color. It's looking really good. Lastly, we have this kind of weird behavior where if you happen to click on the email itself, you don't get anything happening because it's being rendered on top of the input. But in our solution, you can see that doesn't happen. Well, we can disable pointer events for this entire div because it's really just there to see it. So we can use the pointer events none class. And now we can click right through it to the underlying input element. So that's really the basics of how to work with SVG with Tailwind. The answer is basically to just treat it like any other element so that you have kind of full control and flexibility here right in your templates. So let's go over to exercise 10 and give you some practice with this. Here we should have in the exercise file the icon right here. It says it should be color red 500. So go ahead and add that to this input using the positioning techniques we just talked about, making sure to account for all the details here. Like if I kind of have a lot of text here, we still have room for the icon. And so go ahead and give that a shot. Okay, let's compare our work. So back here in our exercise, we've got the SVG icon. And we'll do a similar kind of treatment here. This time it's on the right-hand side, so they'll be a little bit different. But let's go ahead and start with our absolute wrapper. We'll throw the SVG in here. We'll give the SVG a width of 5 and a height of 5. And there we see it. For our positioning div, let's go ahead and use inset Y0 flex item center, just like before. That should vertically center it. But then let's use right 0 so that it hugs the right side of the input over here. Now we can remove the text black, the fill here from the path, and go ahead and make this text red 500. Oops, we forgot to add fill current color. There we go. And we can give it a little bit of breathing room here. Padding right 3. Pull this away from the edge. Pointer events none. And if we go ahead and paste, we don't want that to happen. Let's add that padding to the right of the input here. And now we should be all set. Now you also might have happened to notice sometimes when I add classes to my template here, like padding right 10, and I save it, it kind of resorts. This is another VS Code plugin that I'll link to in the README of the training, which just automatically sorts your classes. Just another nice little workflow tip that makes working with Tailwind a bit more pleasant. Okay, we're getting near the end here, so let's go over to exercise 11. And this is really just kind of a little tip to make sure that you're aware of. If you come to Google and search for Tailwind custom forms, you'll find this little Netlify site. And this is actually a custom Tailwind plugin that was built by the creator of Tailwind CSS and explains that it helps you kind of make forms more easy to style with Tailwind. The default forms in browsers are kind of hard to get consistently looking and feeling the same way. So when it comes time to customize them and build them as part of your UI, if you don't have any sort of reset around forms, it's pretty tough. So that's basically what this is for. And this exercise is just making sure that you're aware of this custom forms plugin and this documentation page. So over here, I have it wired up. And this is basically a copy paste from this getting started right here of this form right here. And you can see, you know, they add some icons to the input tags. And these are all going to look very consistent across browsers. And it's also really easy to change. So for example, this account type right here, if we wanted to make this button a different color, we could just come down to exercise 11, account type, and on our radio button, let's just say it's text green 500. And now when we click on that, it's going to be green. So it's just kind of a nice way to tweak the UI here for form elements. And you'll just see that there's these form dash classes. That's exactly how you use it. So on an input, you apply form input. On a radio, gets form radio, form select, form checkbox. These things make it really easy to work with. So, you know, here we have a custom select, but it's going to look kind of nice and match your theme. Again, in every browser, still using the native select so that when you click it, you get the native UI. But, you know, if we wanted to change the text, well, we can just come to the select right here and say text XL. And it's going to behave exactly how we would expect it to if it was a normal HTML element. So that's more of just a resource to make sure you're aware of. If you are using forms with Tailwind, I definitely recommend using this. I think eventually we'll make its way kind of into the framework officially, but for now, it's just this little plugin that you install and add to your Tailwind config. Okay, so exercise 12. This is another really cool one. I got really excited when I found this one. So the idea with this exercise is you see this kind of really nicely designed component. Some of these components, by the way, are coming from the Tailwind UI project, which are a set of components built with Tailwind, but just goes to show you kind of how nice, beautiful components you can build with Tailwind. I just think a lot of the subtle details here are really great. But anyways, one of the details with this button group is these focus states. And there's a little bit of animation on them, and they look pretty nice. But you'll see over here in the solution, they don't exist. And a problem you'll often run into with focus states is that even as good as these ones look, I think it looks a little bit better. It looks more expected that when you click on a button, you know, you get this feedback from the active state and the hover state, but you don't have extra focus state. And focus state is really there for keyboard accessibility. So you can see here I'm using my tab key and shift tab, and that's what the focus state is designed to help us do. But some browsers like Safari won't even render the focus state when you click on them, but some of them will. So here we're in Chrome, and you can see when I click on this, we get that treatment. So what if we didn't have to make this trade-off? What if we could keep our components accessible and even looking really nice when we're using the keyboard, but when we click on them, we get kind of the treatment we want from a visual perspective? Well, we can do just that with the focus visible polyfill here. So focus visible is a new kind of pseudo state that's coming to CSS. It's not available today, but with this polyfill, we can actually get it today. So the polyfill is just an NPM package. It's called Focus Visible. I've already installed it here over in the project, so you can see it's in our package JSON. And if we check out Ember CLI build, we also import it right here. So depending on your setup, if you're not in an Ember app, it's still is going to be the same idea. You just include this in your bundle, and then you'll be able to use it. So the next question is, how can we use this from the perspective of our developers and us actually writing application code, right? So let's close these old exercises here and pop open 12. So 12 is showing us the button group here, and we can see, these buttons have these classes which are giving us that nice focus state, and they're all using the focus kind of pseudo selector right here. So these are the classes that are giving us the blue shadow. Now, ideally, instead of using focus, we could just use focus visible. Here are the three kind of decorative ones, and we basically want these to be only when you're focusing using the keyboard, which is exactly what this focus visible new CSS pseudo class does. So I think if we could end up with this API, it would be really nice. It fits in with the philosophy of Tailwind. It will probably make its way into the framework at some point. But how would we get this today? Well, if we want to get this today, we could write our own Tailwind plugin. So let's go ahead and open Tailwind config here in App Styles. Here's where we have the Tailwind theme defined and any extensions that we would make. You can see here I'm using Tailwind UI, and we're using the Enter font for our font family. But other than that, it's pretty empty. So let's add this new variant ourselves. First, we're going to const plugin equals require Tailwind CSS plugin. And if you come over to the guides here, the Tailwind guides, and search for custom plugin, writing plugins, this is basically what we're going to follow. And this is a way to hook into Tailwind and do things like add utilities, add components, or even add variants. We can see here there's a whole guide for it. So it says to add a new variant, call the add variant function, passing in the name of your custom variant, and a callback that modifies the affected rules as needed. So this is a cool thing about Tailwind. You can basically just write plugins in line. Here we're using one from Tailwind UI, which is a separate NPM package, but we can also just do this. So what do we say we wanted to add? Well, we want to add the focus visible variant. So let's go ahead and do that right here. And instead of modifying the class by adding a disabled colon, we're going to add this kind of focus visible colon class name class right here. And this, you can see this is hooking into the default browser disabled pseudo state that exists. And we don't have access to that. But what we do have is a new property, which is given to us by this polyfill. So the polyfill is going to add a data focus visible added attribute to any element that was focused with the keyboard. And that's exactly what we want to target. So instead of using that, we'll use our own little data method right here. So that should give us this new focus visible variant available to us to apply to our different classes. Now, if we look back at our template, we'll see we need focus visible on the Z index, on this shadow, and I think we might have missed it for this border right here. So let's pop open the docs for border color right here. So we'll go back to Tailwind, search for border color. And down here we can see the docs on variants. This is true for every module, but we're just getting an example right here. This is how we add variants to our different modules. So we can copy this, come back to our Tailwind config, add a new variants key, and these three are the default. And we're just going to go ahead and add focus visible. And with any luck, if we come back and check out our work, clicking on this first button doesn't trigger the focus state because we're using focus visible. But if I were to select it with the keyboard, there we see the border is turning blue. So I think this is all working. Now we also want this for the box shadow plugin and the Z-index plugin. And if we come back, now we see all the styles are being applied when we focus with the keyboard, but when we click, we don't see anything. Very cool. So let's come back and change the rest of these. We'll grab the focus border blue and make it focus visible, and the shadow outline as well, and also the Z10 right here. Focus visible Z10. And now we have our visual styles kind of being exactly like we would expect them to, but if we start tabbing, we get this really nice focus treatment. And so now we don't have to kind of make this trade-off between the UI, the visual UI that we want, and keeping our UI elements accessible. So I really love this focus visible variant and the polyfill and the plugin. It's a good example of how easy it is to add plugins to Tailwind on your own. And it also is just so nice because, you know, those blue boxes show up everywhere and it's so tempting to disable them. But if you just kind of copy and paste this from project to project, now you have no reason not to keep these around for keyboard users. And so yeah, that's just kind of a great win all around. And, you know, again, we're just to reemphasize, we're keeping all the decision making here in our template. We haven't had to go write CSS, one little plugin, and now we won't break our workflow when it actually comes to styling our application. All right, last exercise here, lesson 13. And this is really just kind of a hard-won lesson, and it has to do with responsive design. So here we can see we're looking at this kind of page navigation treatment. And on desktop, we have the nav items up here. And then when we collapse it, we have this little menu that we can use to expand and see. So, you know, clearly these are two very different UIs, right? The navigation, the mobile menu has this vertical navigation, and then the desktop has this horizontal. And there's, you know, obviously similarities between the treatments, but if you were going to build them, you know, you'd use, you know, very different layouts. And in fact, if we come here and take a look at exercise 13.hbs, we see that we've built this with a desktop menu right here. And then down here, we have kind of the button for the mobile nav. So that's that button. And then down here, if the is open state is true, we go ahead and show the mobile menu right here. So basically right here, you can see our 4 nav items: dashboard, team, projects, and calendar. You know, they're being duplicated here between our mobile menu and our desktop menu. And when you start working on certain layouts, it can be really tempting to try to keep your layout the same and tweak the responsive parts, and even add a lot of wrapping and new elements just to account for, you know, the styling needed on either mobile or desktop. But so many times, especially when the layout radically changes between breakpoints, it's way easier to just split it up in your template. You know, we are duplicating the 4 nav items here and down here, but it's so much cheaper to just copy those and versus making the HTML basically so complex that it's really hard to change and update, because inevitably you're going to have to add new classes and change the styling to account for new things that come your way. So we've just found it's much, much better to just keep these separate. Again, it's kind of a hard-won lesson, going too far down the wrong path and just making it too painful to change things. But here you'll just see on the desktop menu, the wrapper here has a hidden class, which is just display none, right? So you can see right here, display none. So it's not going to show up. And then on medium size, we go to flex. And so that's going to make it visible. And then same down here with the mobile menu, you know, it uses the is open state to say whether it shows or hides, because even when we're on mobile, the menu isn't always there. But on desktop, the menu should never be there regardless of that is open state. So you can see here, we have the medium hidden class applied. And this will always take precedence over these two. And so this is just really simple, you know, good technique, hiding the content that you don't need on the screen sizes where you don't need it, and being able to keep these layouts separate, it's just worked really well for us, and we feel like it's a really good solution for some of these trickier kind of page-wide layouts. Now, if you really did want to remove this duplication, how might you do it? Well, we have a front-end framework here. It's pretty easy to loop over data. So dashboard, team, projects, and calendar, why don't we just come over to our component, create a new links property with dashboard, team, projects, and calendar, right? You can see where I'm going with this. And instead of just rendering these like this, we can just each over this dot links as link. You'd probably want an href in here, but just to keep it simple for the sake of this. And I think this dashboard link is actually active. So let's just grab these inactive ones, render one of these, get rid of the rest, render out the link. And now we have our 4 nav items right here. And we can do the same thing down here for the mobile menu. But, we have our own link tags down here. We have our own set of classes. And so, just, again, embracing this philosophy of keeping things separate, keeping things small, not getting stuck into too bad of an abstraction that's hard to undo later. And so now we have no duplication of this content. If this were dynamically generated from a backend or something, or we were to add a new link, we only have to do it in one place and everything works just fine. So again, that's just, explaining that these are kind of different problems we're solving. If there's a duplication problem here, there's one way to solve it. This is just one way. You could also imagine kind of creating a higher order contextual component that renders the 2 menus separately, but from the calling perspective, maybe in your application template, you only have to pass in the data once if you wanted to do it in the template instead of on, a JavaScript class like this. But keeping your HTML code maintainable and easy to understand, that's kind of a separate concern. And so when the layout is really different between breakpoints, just go ahead and split it up. It's the simplest thing to do. So kind of the last point I want to make about this template here, and about responsive design in JavaScript frameworks like Ember, is that we used to use JavaScript to detect the viewport width a lot more and have that affect our design. So you could imagine something like here in the desktop menu, instead of using these Tailwind CSS classes to say, go ahead and hide this on mobile and then let this show up on medium sizes, we could use a JavaScript helper to say something like, if screen dot is mobile or up, right? And then we would just render this. And the cool thing about this is that Ember wouldn't be doing any extra work on smaller screens, so it wouldn't render any of this. And then once JavaScript detects that the screen is bigger, let's say if the user kind of reorients their device or makes a window bigger, then it would go ahead and render this. So from that perspective, it can save some work that the rendering engine has to do on the client's behalf. But the problem with it is that it's not robust to server-side rendering. So because JavaScript isn't running on the server and it doesn't know the size of your device, if you were to pre-render your app on the server, let's say using Fastboot with Ember, when you ship that up and it initially renders, you're going to have to just make a decision about which UI to render. And you can end up with some bugs there. We've had that on our own projects before, where basically we're showing the desktop version, and so it renders that first with just static HTML and CSS, and then once the JavaScript kicks in, it realizes you're on a mobile device, and so things flicker and they start hiding kind of once JavaScript takes over and hydrates the page. So since learning all of that, and again going through that kind of hard lesson 1, we've basically unraveled all of that usage of JavaScript to look at the viewport and instead just rely on CSS media queries using these responsive prefixes like MD and LG and everything. So again, there's a nice win here where it's just one way to do things. You stay in Tailwind, you stay with your classes right here, and you also make sure that your site is going to work on that initial render, because if everything is in Tailwind classes when the browser actually renders your screen, it knows what the screen dimensions are, and so it's going to know which classes to show and which ones to hide. So just one last little takeaway when it comes to making these kind of larger, complex, responsive layouts with Tailwind and Ember. So that is all I have for you today. Be sure to check out the README in the repo for links to the custom forms plugin and the Focus Visible polyfill, all of these VS Code extensions that I use to make working with Tailwind a lot easier, and the docs and Tailwind UI and all that stuff. Tailwind really is one of my favorite parts of building web development. In the last few years especially, I feel like I've learned so much. Really one of the biggest things for me with Tailwind, even if I were to ever work on a project that didn't use Tailwind, there's so much that I've learned from it about choosing color, working with SVGs, understanding Flexbox layouts, thinking about composition that I would bring with me to any project that I went to. So I really feel like the best way to use Tailwind is to understand from the creator's perspective, the philosophy of the creator and the maintainers, how they approach this stuff. That's going to be the best way to get the most out of Tailwind, and you're also probably going to learn a lot of new stuff from that as well. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you learned a thing or two, and have fun styling your app with Tailwind.